Pressure is mounting on Ottawa, as you heard there, to call an inquiry into allegations of Chinese foreign interference in federal elections. The Prime Minister insists existing mechanisms are enough to dig into those allegations, but his critics are not convinced. Is the front bench? Let's find out. With me this evening, former Chief of Staff to Jim Carr, Carleen Varayan. She's an Associate Vice President with Summa Strategies now. Former Communications Director to Aaron O'Toole, Melanie Paradis is here. She's now the President of Texture Communications. NDP strategist and Monk & Associates Principal Owner Kathleen Monk is with us, as is Le Devoir columnist Emily Nicolas. Hi, everybody. Very good to see you. Melanie, I'm going to start with you because it's your old boss who originally sounded an alarm about this, I think, before he had even, or maybe just after he had exited that role. What are you thinking about as you see this play out now on an even bigger stage in the national media over the past week?
As leader, we had started to hear from some of the candidates on the ground who were raising the alarm bells about the experience that they had, particularly the influence in WeChat and some of the other tools that were being used to allegedly interfere with the election. He raised this before his departure as leader and has since continued to speak to this. And I want to make clear, at no point in time has he indicated that this would have changed the result of the election. I think it's important for partisans on all sides to recognize that the challenge that we're dealing with foreign interference, the question is not whether the result of the election would have been changed. The issue is this is a threat that is continuing to grow, and it could impact future elections as well. And so we really need to have a public inquiry into exactly what happened in 2021 and in 2019, what techniques were being used, what tactics, who was involved in them, and make sure that we make any changes that are necessary to ensure that this does not happen again in future elections at all levels of government, whether that be federal, provincial, or municipal, because this is an active threat.
I think, Carleen, especially starting from the point that Melanie did, right? We're not saying that the outcome of the election was stolen, as you know, we know is the case in the United States, but we do know stuff happened. It is a bit confusing to me that there is such a resistance to, maybe it's not an inquiry, but some higher level of inquisition on this, given the nature of the questions, the nature of the allegations, and the fact that nobody is saying that the election was stolen.
I think one of the most important things that public officials, governments can do when it comes to preserving trust in a democracy, which is incredibly important, is to acknowledge and nuance that distinction between attempts at interference and actual interference in an outcome or a result. There's no question, and it has been discussed quite publicly by the Canadian government and its agencies for some time now, that countries like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea in particular, all engage in efforts on a regular basis, including in election cycles, to interfere. There are already some established bodies that do look at this. There are things like the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, which meets regularly. There are the national threat assessments that get published for the public every year. As to the question of whether an inquiry about the specific 2021 election would yield new things, I'm skeptical that it would, just given the very sensitive nature of a lot of this information. But I think the broader point here that the Prime Minister demonstrated a lot of sensitivity to today was, this is a very dangerous game that we start to play when we start to sow doubt about the intentions of a person or a candidate running for office because they don't come from here or because they don't look like some of the rest of the people who make up the majority of our population. And that's something that we also have to be very careful about.
I think you're talking about Han Dong and those allegations specifically, because that's what he made those comments in reference to, Kathleen. I would say a few things. First of all, that reporting comes from Global News, and I would not want to insinuate that that was their objective there. It's a very lengthy report. It's somebody who has reported extensively on the issue over the past number of months. They're allegations. They're not proven at this point, right? The allegation, just for everybody watching, is that this individual, who is a Liberal MP, was involved in these interference efforts, and the Prime Minister was warned by security officials, who he says, by the way, don't do that, but was warned about confirming his nomination, and despite that went ahead with it. He didn't address the specifics of that, but did sort of say, I stand by Mr. Dong, and as well, that's not the place of security officials, which is what both Dick Fadden and Ward Elcock said to me. At the same time, I take the point about wanting to be sensitive to that, wanting to be sensitive to the issues around sowing doubt, but I'm not sure it's fair to constantly say, well, you're sowing doubt just for raising some questions about now, CSIS reports that the Globe is reporting say there was some untoward stuff happening.
Yeah, and this is day 10 of this story, right? Just the 2021 election story, which started on February 17th with the Globe and Mail and has grown since then. It doesn't seem like it's going to ebb. The House is coming back, shortly next week, and things will start to kick up again. So I think really it is time that the government kind of name and shame. Other countries have done that. In the United Kingdom, they have named agents of Beijing, and that has allowed members of parliament in the United Kingdom to avoid influence or avoid accepting donations. This happens in other countries. But I think what the debate today is centering around is whether this has to be a public inquiry, a nonpartisan public inquiry, or whether this can happen in the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, a committee that happens on the Hill. And I think there's a good criticism about those committees because they can often be political debating clubs. And that's not what we want right now. And whether we should be looking backwards at past elections, or maybe, as Carlene suggested, I think is actually what would be most useful, is a series of recommendations, whether from academics, whether from politicos, but how we can prevent this in the future. Right now we have a system, and particularly nomination meetings, where, people can vote in those nomination meetings as long as they're a party member. And I think that they are open, and they are some of the fiercest battles that take place at that nomination level. They're more difficult at times than winning the actual election in some ridings. So how do parties, manage that? I mean, Dick Fadden, who I have immense respect for, just said that parties should have a duty to police this and then possibly given penalties. I'm not sure if the party apparatus has the ability to be the checks and balances on foreign interference. So that's another question that, frankly, politicians and academics should look into.
And I feel like, just to round it out, Emily, if I think everybody is hoping to avoid this in the future, to figure out how to prevent it. But can you determine the best tools to do that if you don't have all the information at your disposal?
No, and at the contrary, I think not having all the information is what is going to be sowing the doubt, to be taking that phrase again. Essentially, it seems that the Trudeau Liberals are in a position where they believe that people are really safe about democracy. They believe in Canadian institutions and that we don't want to sow doubts to destroy that. It's interesting that they're saying that just after the Rouleau report essentially described a movement of Canadians who already have a lot of doubt about the way the Canadian democracy has been working. And so that movement is already here. And with stories like that out there, and a refusal to be as transparent as possible, to be as nonpartisan as possible in the way we look into it, that kind of movement that was just described in the Rouleau report is only likely to grow. That is one thing that really worries me. The other thing that really worries me is that when you don't have answers to all of those questions, what happens is the doubts will mostly impact the people who are actually Chinese Canadians, who are trying to get involved in politics. And then if you don't know who are the actors, who is what, then everybody who might be of a Chinese origin could be impacted in terms of trying to be involved in political organizing in the future if parties are just trying to play safe. And so that is really, really nasty as well. And that's a very possible outcome as well. We've seen that in the past already when a specific diaspora is trying to get involved in politics. There's obviously some undertones of racism in there that makes it that people are like, oh, are these real members? Are these people who are actually Canadians? And so if we don't solve that, if we don't figure out who's responsible for what, then everybody of Asian descent, actually, because people are sometimes too ignorant to make the difference, could be impacted in this and the way they're involved in Canadian politics, and that would be absolutely irresponsible as an outcome.
That's a really good point.